With the NBA draft over and free agency set to begin June 30th, it's time to take a look at some free agents that the Cavaliers may want to think about bringing on board. Let's start with the point guard position. First off is a very familiar face in Ricky Rubio. The Cavs could re-sign Rubio, but because of his injury, which happens to be his second ACL tear to his left knee, even if they were able to do so, they would have to manage without him until mid-season at the earliest, in my opinion. Now, we already know what kind of impact a healthy Rubio can have on this Cavaliers team, as he is a very steadying presence in the best way imaginable. When Darius Garland leaves the court, the drop-off is so minimal that you wouldn't be mistaken if you thought DG never left. We've seen that they can operate very well together, and to be honest with you all, I wasn't sold initially on the pairing. It seemed as if Ricky Rubio started to take more of the late game role over Colin Sexton. But I can honestly understand why they chose to do so, and it worked out very, very well, as he allows for more off-ball opportunities for Garland and can create for others. Now, his shooting splits from this season weren't anything to get hype about, but he certainly held his own and played better than his stat line suggests. Now, we know that there is definitely interest on both sides in regards to bringing Ricky back, but the biggest hurdle remains the injury and the dollar and cent amount. The Cavs have a small amount to work with in free agency, really only being able to utilize the mid-level exception. Number 2 on the list is Delon Wright. Now, Delon Wright is an older point guard who didn't show out statistically for the Atlanta Hawks, but he did have a very big impact this season off the bench and is a really good defender at the position. He was a bright spot on a very woeful Atlanta Hawks defense at times. And perhaps the best thing about him is that he doesn't need the ball in his hands to be effective. Now, to put that into further perspective, he didn't qualify for the leaderboard in regards to usage rate, but had he qualified, he would have had the third lowest rate in the league at 10.3%. He actually led the team in steals and would fit nicely with the Cavs' culture of team over individual players. Unfortunately, Atlanta holds his bird rights, and he may cost more than the mid-level exception that the Cavs can offer at this point, so we'll have to see what ends up happening. The next up on the list is Tyus Jones. Now, the Cavs ought to monitor the Tyus Jones situation as they look to add additional pieces to surround their young core with. Jones will be one of the most coveted point guards on the market once free agency officially begins. Now, I want you guys to take something into account. Ja Morant missed 25 games this season, and Jones was able to help keep the ship afloat in his absence. Memphis actually went 19-4 in the regular season in games in which Jones was the starter. He ultimately views himself that way as well too. He echoed this sentiment lately when he stated, "I've always viewed myself as a starter, even coming off the bench." Jones said, "A lot of times being called one of the best backups in the league, I never called myself that. I always just viewed that I was just a starter that's coming off the bench. That's always been my mindset." And in the last 4 seasons, he's managed to lead the NBA in assist to turnover ratio. He averaged 8.7 points and 4.4 assists in 21.2 minutes this season. In games he started, Jones averaged 12.7 points and 6.6 assists. He also improved his 3-point percentage this season, going from 32.1% all the way up to 39%, albeit on low volume at 2.8 attempts per game. It's worth noting that Memphis holds his bird rights, and he made $8.4 million this season and will likely command a pay raise. There's no mistaking that. That could make it difficult to land him in free agency for Cleveland, but an interesting option nonetheless. Next up is none other than Raelon Nitto. Now, Raelon Nitto would be an interesting addition to this Cavs team because on the one hand, he would add veteran leadership and experience to such a young roster, but at the same time, he might face some of the same criticisms as Cleveland's other guards, and that is his lack of size. Nitto is listed at about 6'2", 180 pounds, and to be honest with you, that might be a little on the generous side of town. he would likely need to be featured in lineups with size around him. Now, I'm not quite sure what a lineup consisting of both himself and Darius Garland, for instance, would look like defensively either. With that said, he could be a cheap option off the bench who knows how to move the ball and get others involved without overcomplicating things. And at 30 years old, he is likely to already know his role and shouldn't have a problem playing it. He could serve in essentially the same role as Rubio did, albeit likely smaller. If he could provide in the neighborhood of somewhere between 15 to 20 minutes on a nightly basis for the Cavs, he will be well worth it if they strike out elsewhere. Now, he doesn't come without his flaws. I want you guys to understand that, as he rarely heads to the charity stripe and is a very inconsistent three-point shooter with a career 36.6 mark from range. But he also notched a career high in assists per game with 3.1 per contest in just 19.6 minutes per game this season. Last, but certainly not least, is also a familiar face, and that is none other than Brandon Goodwin. Brandon Goodwin played well enough, in my opinion, to warrant another shot at securing a role with the team on the permanent roster. He was signed as a two-way player midway through the 21-22 season and had some noteworthy games. Take his 21-point explosion against the New Orleans Pelicans back on January 31st, in which he went 8 of 11 from the field, including 3 of 4 from three-point range. He showed flashes during his short time with the Cavaliers, and his 6.5 assists per 36 minutes aren't bad for a two-way dart throw. And if given a significant complement of minutes this season, there's no telling how big of an impact he could make. And at the very least, the Cavaliers should think about bringing him back on another two-way if he's available. Now, I'll say this, Goodwin didn't seem too keen on the idea of again being buried on the depth chart behind Darius Garland, Colin Sexton, and any other point guard on the roster. And when on April 21st, he tweeted out the infamous words, "Not a third point guard." So it would appear that he wants a larger role, and honestly, why shouldn't he? He has bounced around the league a bit and probably just wants an opportunity that he can prove that he's more than just an end of bench guard. So we'll see what happens.